Shop Plato's Closet tax-free August 2nd through 4th for back-to-school styles. We sell the trendy, gently used styles you need to make a difference in the world and in your wallet for back-to-school shopping. Save up to 70% off regular retail prices by choosing recycled styles. Save even more when you shop tax-free this weekend. Make a change that others can respect and repeat. Shop Plato's Closet in North Charleston and West Ashley this year for your back-to-school looks. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.
You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is sponsored by Codify, a California benefit corporation. Visit Codify at www.codifi.com.
Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthal.
Welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast, episode 68. I'm your host, Sarah Head, and I'm joined today by my co-hosts, Ken Fader and Jeb Card. Today we're discussing the Polynesian connection. Did prehistoric Polynesian sailors make it to the East Coast? Did they bring chickens and take sweet potatoes home with them? What does an actual controversy look like within the archaeological field, and how do archaeologists handle it when we're presented with evidence? Get ready to think critically.
You will see are a staple of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast. I am your host, Sarah, and I am joined today by my co-hosts, Ken Fader and Jeb Card. How's it going, guys?
It's going great, except right now I've got an airplane flying over my house. So for our next podcast, I'll try to redirect the air traffic so we don't get that background noise.
Yeah. Well, I can't hear it. I can't hear it, so maybe it's my. I can't hear it, so maybe it's my fault.
Yeah.
But we could just
not that that means anything. So we're enjoying lovely February weather. 70 degrees and high winds and tornadoes and such. I mean, that's normal for February in northern United States.
Yeah, for thousands and thousands of years.
Yeah, no worries.
It was 80 degrees when I went to the zoo on Friday. 80 degrees in DC.
That's pretty messed up. Messed up. We've got the daffodils and crocuses are coming up in February here.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, the daffodils that they planted in the little in between the roads here are all blooming now, and I'm just like, well, that's pretty. I keep thinking it's March.
This is fine. Everything is fine.
Everything is fine.
It's just situation normal. Absolutely.
Yeah, whatever. But anyway, so today we're going to talk about some things that may or may not have been affected by global climate change. We're going to talk about we've talked about diffusionism on the show before and why we do and don't like the idea. Well, we don't like the idea, but why it's not a great idea. But people have emailed and asked if we could talk about actual controversies that are had within the archaeological community by actual professional archaeologists. And we've discussed some, and this is another one that I thought we could touch on, which is the Polynesians making it to the Americas in the prehistoric past.
Right.
And
in the relatively recent past too.
Right.
Yeah.
1,000 years or so.
Yeah.
And remember that this actually was a real big thing with Thor Heyerdahl and his Kon-Tiki experiment back. Was that in the 50s or 60s?
In the 50s, late 40s and 50s.
And he was arguing for the other direction, right?
Right. He was arguing for Peru the other way. Well, Heyerdahl. So interestingly, with Heyerdahl, and I don't want to derail, but we already are. Heyerdahl. Interestingly, one of the things that is often really minimized about him is that his stuff was not his later stuff, but early on, he was actually a lot closer to some of the stuff we often rail about. Because most people are like, well, he was wrong about Peru, but maybe the other way, and he got in a boat, and that's awesome. And there was a TV show or a movie. Right. He actually did talk about whiteness early on when he was younger. He talked in more hyperdiffusionary terms.
Did he? Okay.
Of the sort that I don't have the book with me, maybe for the show notes, but something like Thor Heyerdahl and the Atomic Age or something. I ran into a few years ago that pointed this out. And in fact, there were maps and labels for maps and things that were used, and this is right after World War II, in a German edition or a European edition that were not used in an American edition for reasons that I think you can guess.
Sure.
But I mean, he kind of abandoned that, and he was very young when he did that. But yeah, there's some interesting underpinnings to some of that. But nonetheless, it still is usually more benign than a lot of the things we often talk about.
And Heyerdahl, actually, he was a talking head. He was interviewed in the BBC Horizon response to von Däniken. So it was the case of the search for ancient astronauts, a case of the ancient astronauts. And he says quite clearly that folks living all over the world in what are non-Western societies are far smarter than people in Western societies, and we're perfectly capable of carving the stones on Easter Island. And so he speaks out very strongly against ancient astronauts, ancient aliens.
Yeah, the closest he ever got to that, I would say, other than initially very early on, the closest he ever got to that was when he was also trying to argue for Egypt. He liked the idea that the boats
right.
Yeah, and that one fell apart in him. I mean, the raw boat just literally disintegrated in the Atlantic because, as we're going to see, ocean currents matter. And that's one of the reasons why we're talking about this today. And even then, that would only be if you go with the old-timey, like Grafton Elliott Smith, Egyptians were white, or Flinders Petrie, Egyptians were white, blah, blah, which I have not read Heyerdahl closely enough if he ever said that. I suspect he didn't, actually. I don't know. Just, you mentioned Eric. Yeah, no, apparently they just republished a book of his in English that he had done in 2011 on the Maya.
How was it?
I don't know. I can't touch that.
You can't hardly wait to get one of those, right?
No. I think that's not unlike Superman and Kryptonite, except not the Kryptonite that hurts, because that would give it power, but more like the one that there's the one it was a Superman 3 where it makes him drunk. It would probably be closer to that. Anyway, I don't want to diverge. I just saw that he did an entire Maya-centric book. I'm like, oh, well, that's lovely. That's lovely.
Well, it's time to publish it. 5 years after 2012.
Well, that's apparently the thing. Apparently it was written with all the 2012ness, and I'm like, wow, that's some smooth moves there. We specifically did not put a 2012 article, although we probably mentioned it once, in Lost City Found Pyramid. For that reason, it has a literal expiration date.
There you go.
In fact, is a literal expiration date.
Take it off the shelf.
All right, but bring us back around. Right. So we've talked about, now that this kind of hits on two topics that we have gone over, with the diffusionism being one of them, and the other one being independent invention.
Right. And
that'll come in later when we talk about the boats, but the two strongest pieces of evidence, I think, for Polynesian contact with the Americas is the sweet potato and, well, it was the chicken, but I think we've kind of blown that one out of the water. But this Polynesian contact thing, and I want our listeners to be aware of this, this is one of those things that we do discuss as an academic field and as professionals, because it is possible, but is not
super interesting.
It's super interesting too, because it was so close to maybe actually happening, but we don't have any really hard evidence to support that it did happen. So just because it could happen doesn't mean that it did.
Yeah, that's the thing. This is all about evidence. You will see, especially in the popular treatments of this story in newspapers, online, and even among those people who are supporters of this notion that the Polynesians got to South America, is that they keep getting back to, if we say, well, we are skeptical, we're not sure there's sufficient evidence, the argument that you'll hear is, oh, you think that those Polynesians could not have found South America? And that's a distraction and a deflection, because no one here is saying they were incapable of, hey man, they found a dot, Easter Island, which is a dot.
If anybody's going to find South America, it's the friggin' Polynesians.
Exactly.
They were good at that sort of thing.
And we're not saying that they couldn't have. This is an argument all about, just as Sarah said, could have doesn't mean did. The did part is, what is the archaeological, what is the genetic evidence that's been presented to support the claim that, in fact, Polynesians made it to South America. That's really all this is about. It's not about could they have. we will stipulate absolutely that if, as Jeb just said, if anybody could have found South America, it was the Polynesians. But now the mere fact that they could have doesn't mean that they did. Let's look at the evidence. And as Sarah pointed out, we're talking about sweet potatoes here and chickens. I don't know, you want to talk about the chickens first, only because that seems to be, it's got a nice arc to that story where it was presented, it was responded to, and now we're sort of sitting here thinking maybe that evidence was not sufficient to support the claim.
If it helps our listeners, I could have gone and had a really fun time Saturday night. It's possible, but I didn't.
Right.
Yeah, but I think a lot of people, having listened to you, Jeb, would say, well, no, it's probably
maybe it's not possible.
Really plausible. It's not plausible that Jeb could have.
All right, because it's kind of like Vikings. They could get a little far in, but not the whole way.
That's awesome.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly.
This is going places.
The chicken thing, what we're talking about is, I think it's 2007. Alice Stories, an archaeologist, excavating a site in, I think it was Chile, found
yes, I believe so.
50 chicken bones. And the 50 chicken bones were derived from 5 individual birds, and it's Gallus gallus. It's the regular old world chicken species.
Chickens.
It's chickens. And the radiocarbon dates that she derived from that site put the site at between 1320 and about 1410. That's AD 1320.
Which I will say this, as a colonial archaeologist, you will see things like this. Like I deal with like styles of pottery, and like you see plates. And it's like, if you're seeing something that looks kind of something else and it starts to get really close to contact period, I just want to say that's another issue. That's another issue. Because if it's really close to contact period, I would love it not to be that close if you're trying to argue for separation. It doesn't mean it couldn't happen that way. Right. That is entirely possible. It can only be 100 years, but that would be a yellow flag. Maybe not a red flag, but a yellow flag.
And I think it's important to tell people that the reason why we would want a different or an older date is because when you start getting that close to contact, even with the C14, there is a margin of error there that can lean one way or the other. And if it leans the other way, then it completely, it puts those chickens into the modern.
If they're giving that date, that I suspect that is taking that in consideration, but I agree with you. And the broader issue is also recognizing. So, for example, I work in a number of different things, but one of the things I've done is colonial archaeology. And you will see people who will write about like, oh, this is Aztec and this is colonial period. And they'll say like, because these are the first colonial bits we find. And they're showing me like olive jars from the 15th, like basically they're kind of like if you know classical, like an amphora, storage jar, same sort of thing, like from the 1570s, because they have types, and there's one that was before the 1570s, one from like the 1570s to later, and then a later one, and they're like, oh yeah, there's like this kind of maiolica and like a middle style olive jar, and like this is colonial because we have colonial bits, and I'm like, this thing was made 60 years after Cortez burned Tenochtitlan to the ground. In all likelihood, the tail end of what you're calling Aztec in this particular case is probably the early colonial period. And I gave an essay paper about this. And I'm not saying that's what's happening in this case. I suspect it's not, because there's other issues here. But that's one of these things we have to be very careful about when we're talking about these kinds of topics. Also.
So Jeb, I have a question for you as a scholar working in the colonial period. One of the arguments given by the folks who want to believe, in fact, that Polynesians made it to South America and they brought chickens was that in 1532, Pizarro reports that chickens are an integral part of Inca diet. And the Portuguese maybe had sailed along that coast maybe 30 years earlier. Is 30 years enough time? The argument being that they were such an important part of the diet, they were so integrated into subsistence, it's impossible that Europeans could have introduced them only 30 years before.
Well, the thing I would say, that seems really unlikely. And also, I work in Central America. I mean, I'm familiar with South American archaeology. I don't want to be a jerk, but I probably know South American archaeology better than either of you, but it's not my thing.
Oh, yeah. No one's arguing.
I would have a hard time with that. It's not like if you go digging, you find chicken bones everywhere at these sites. I would have to look into that further, but that also makes me wonder if it's one of those, we call it a thing in the colonial period when it's really not that thing. I mean, remember
Gotcha.
the Maya word, I mean, they would do stuff like, I mean, infamously, they would use words like, for example, a few years ago, Jason wrote a post about this. There was, I think it was the Turkish president, Erdogan, I could be wrong about that. He was very happy because Columbus talked about seeing mosques in the Caribbean. Well, they weren't. That was literally the word that a guy who was from a culture that just was throwing Muslims out of Spain would use for something exotic.
Right.
Yeah. They also called these things, they called the Aztec pyramids, they called them towers.
Right.
They're not really towers, but I could see why you'd call them that. And you get a lot of that. And it goes the other way. The Yucatec Maya word for chicken today, actually, is gosh. And the reason is gosh is that's short for Castellano ulum. An ulum is a turkey. And so they called it Castellano ulum, but they shortened it to cash. So basically it means Spanish turkey because they knew what a turkey was because they'd had it for thousands of years. And their word for chicken is a Spanish turkey because they didn't have any other word for it. A lot of that happens in the colonial period. I mean, we see words that initially get picked up like cacique. You see that all throughout the Spanish world. That's a word from the Caribbean. Once they pick it up in the Caribbean, they assume, well, all Indians, which of course is a whole other word that's a problem.
Right.
That's the whole point, is these words quickly start to get thrown out. And even we do this. I mean, we call spear throwers atlatls because that was the first people that Europeans ran into that had spear throwers, and they were the Aztecs. Yes. But we now call them atlatls. Like, oh, look at this North American atlatl. This North American what? Yeah. So I suspect it's something like that. I'd have to look into it though. I don't know that.
Well, to be fair,
they had Muscovy ducks. That was the main domesticates in South America were llamas, alpacas, guinea pigs, Muscovy ducks. Mm-hmm. In Central America, there were turkeys.
So it's possible that they're finding like duck and duck eggs and
I don't know those particular Pizarro records.
Gotcha. Okay.
Right. It's not something I have looked at carefully enough to be able to say anything further on that.
Just as since we go off on tangents a lot, this whole business of using words, of misinterpreting words. In Connecticut, we have the site called Gunjiwam, which the traditional explanation is that it's an interesting farmstead. It's 19th century. And we have a bunch of fringe people saying, oh, no, it's ancient, and it was there before Europeans got here. And those folks have found a statement in a historical document that dates to the early 1700s about there being a fort in Mystic. And these modern folks are interpreting the word fort to mean, well, it must be a big stone structure, where in fact, the use of the word fort in those days meant a palisaded village was a fort. So it's this misuse of a word, assuming a modern interpretation of that word is correct, and applying it centuries back. You've got to be really careful when you do that. But that's, again, I'm not a linguist either, and there's another issue there.
Let me actually, we're coming up on our break. Let me actually give a little kind of story that I think maybe puts some of this in context. And I want to say this straight out. None of us are linguists. None of us play linguists on television. And more importantly, none of us are linguistic anthropologists, which is really kind of a different thing. That's really, when we're saying linguists, we're really talking about linguistic anthropologists, which is a whole different, well, not whole different, but I know people that bristle when they're called a linguist rather than a linguistic anthropologist. But when I was a long time ago, 23 years ago, when I was in early graduate school and I had to take a core course in linguistic anthropology, we had to read various things in graduate seminars. This was a mixed grad undergrad thing, and I'm saying this all for a reason. It's not just because I'm old. Get off my lawn. But, to be fair, get off my lawn. But in graduate seminar, you have to read a book or an article or a set of articles and critically address them. And I ended up with Joseph Greenberg's book on language in the Americas. I think it may later be called Language in the Americas. And he's famous for arguing for basically a large unified, there was one big push of language that most Native American languages other than the last couple, like in the Aleutians and a few others in the north, are all basically unified, arguing for one big push early on and then two smaller ones much later. he was largely accurate, although we now know that it's more complicated, much more complicated very early on. But his methods were a mess. And I took this course with Judy Maxwell, and she very much loved this part of it because he would take words that kind of sort of sound the same, but if you had really loose rules, it's like, well, this is word whatever that starts with a B for the word arm. Well, over here, there's a word for arm that also starts with a B. It's like, that's not how historical linguistics really works. Right. And so Greenberg was really trying to create this unity out of very loose rules. On the other hand, in the grand scheme, he clearly had some interesting insights because his larger scheme wasn't entirely wrong, but he would routinely link things together that really, if you look at it, don't really work that way. And then he'd go to another case and the rules would bend in a somewhat different way. And again, I'm saying this as somebody who read his stuff for graduate school, but I bring this all up because this kind of issue seems to show up a lot. Like, looks the same is the same, sounds the same is the same when it comes to hyperdiffusion. And I've talked about this on the show before. I probably would be considered something of an expert in hyperdiffusion as it actually happens in, for example, colonial context. Like, what if people come across the ocean and really did colonize a place? What would that look like? Right. And the answer is the evidence has to be a lot more specific. You have to have objects that really came from the place, and you have to have stuff that is clearly and also contextually makes sense. And a lot of this stuff often doesn't make sense. So after the break, I think we're going to look at some of these specifics with that as kind of the frame.
Sure.
Chicken tacos should only be trusted to chicken professionals.
That's where we come in. Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One comes with pico de gallo and creamy chipotle ranch. And the other comes with bacon, lettuce, tomato, and avocado ranch. Chicken experts since 1990. Chicken taco experts since now. Order yours today in the Zax Rewards app. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
Shop Plato's Closet tax-free August 2nd through 4th for back-to-school styles. We sell the trendy, gently used styles you need to make a difference in the world and in your wallet for back-to-school shopping. Save up to 70% off regular retail prices by choosing recycled styles. Save even more when you shop tax-free this weekend. Make a change that others can respect and repeat. Shop Plato's Closet in North Charleston and West Ashley this year for your back-to-school looks. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.
And we are back. So we were talking about chickens, and yes. Ken brought up. So we were talking about chickens, and we were talking about chickens because they were originally used as evidence for contacts or possible evidence of contact with the Polynesians with South America and the California coast.
Yeah, that was the article published in 2007.
Right.
Yes, and I remember being super excited by that.
Yeah.
Right.
But what happens, of course, is that it was in 2013. A much broader analysis of chicken genetics took place.
And we have we've discussed genetics on the show before, and I feel like in that episode we kind of talked about how genetics are not the end all be all, but they can prove a lot of good things.
Right.
And this is one of those really good things that genetics can step in and help correct. And then, unfortunately, it removes chickens as decent evidence for Polynesian contact. But
yeah, so it's Vicky Thompson, who's a geneticist, and they had 122 modern samples of chickens from Polynesia and 22 archaeological samples, and they had the genetic information from the chicken bones in South America. And effectively what they figured out was that, I think when we had Jennifer Raff on, didn't we talk about mitochondrial haplogroups?
Yes.
And when applied to the settlement of the Americas, whether it's
yes.
A, B, C, D, and X, and those haplogroups are found in Native Americans, and some of them at least are found in Northeast Asia. So there's that connection. Well, applying a similar kind of analysis, what Thompson determined was that chickens in Polynesia, there are two fundamental haplogroups, and they're haplogroups D and E. But the deal is that D is the most common. If you find D in 100% of the samples from Rapa Nui, Easter Island, were haplogroup D, and very high percentages of haplogroup D were spread throughout Polynesia. This is both in modern or relatively recent chicken remains and archaeological remains. the haplogroup in South America, the archaeological sample was haplogroup E, which apparently is a worldwide, that you find E virtually all over the world. And what they did a bunch of mathematical statistical manipulations and came up with these various trees, genetic trees, and said that it is far more likely that the chickens in South America came there from Europe.
Yeah.
Now, the problem, of course, is that doesn't fit. You've got the issue is if you've got radiocarbon dates.
The dates, yeah.
The dates don't match that because there are no Europeans in South America at that time.
100 years later, there are, though.
About 100 years later, there are. And when you look at the vicissitudes of radiocarbon dating, you've got to consider the possibility that the dates are simply not correct.
Yeah, 1 out of 20 radiocarbon dates at 2 sigma will be wrong.
Right. And so you've got that there's that every possibility that if the genetic now, of course, Alice Story, who the original researcher, has responded. This is back and forth in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and she says, well, they haven't proven that at all because, in fact, she was highly critical of the fact that most of the samples that were used by Thompson were of modern chickens. And she says, well, of course, there's been all this cross-contamination and on and on and on. Effectively, a handful of chicken bones in South America that may or may not date to before European contact, and the chicken bones don't look like they actually genetically are derived from Polynesian chickens. That kind of evidence is not what I think anybody would be comfortable with as being really strong, definitive evidence that Polynesians made it to South America. Then again, we're not saying they could not have gotten there. We're not saying they weren't capable of it. We're saying that specific piece of evidence is not very strong.
Well, in the Nat Geo article you sent, actually the final paragraph would be my answer. And I'll just simply read it. If the presence of pre-Columbian chickens, this is a quote from the article by Rolf Smith for National Geographic, March 19, 2014. If the presence of pre-Columbian chickens is a good indicator that Polynesians succeeded in crossing the Pacific, the absence of one of their old shipmates, Rattus exulans, the Pacific rat, makes an equally compelling case against it. The Pacific rat is known to have traveled everywhere with their Polynesian hosts, and wherever they landed, they invariably established thriving local rat populations that live on to this day. There are no Pacific rats in South America. I mean, that's the problem. It's the old, well, I've got this thing that looks like a carving from somewhere else. Oh, do you have their foodstuffs? No.
Exactly.
Do you have their wheels? No. Do you have their metallurgy? No. Do you have their genetics? No. But this looks like this.
Yeah. The lack of significant pieces of evidence of things that we would expect. Ken and I go on about garbage all the time, but the lack of these things is excellent evidence against an argument. And as Jeb's pointing out, with the lack of rats, I mean,
I don't think that would be 100% against it, but I would not feel
pretty
comfortable
compelling
making that. I would point out this is really weird, and maybe somebody should look at it. But going farther than that, when you don't, if I was at, and there actually are examples of this, and I don't think we can get into this because I don't think we've done enough background research. But there's famously the Kalishtlawaka head, this little Roman figurine head that was found. I want to say at like a Teotihuacan period site in Mexico, and it's a little Roman figurine head. Now, where's the rest?
Right.
And the fact that it's something very stylistically, obviously, no question, Roman. If it was Samian ware, I would still have problems with it. But the fact that it's like, by the way, this has neon signs that say Roman on it makes me wonder if we're dealing with somebody who placed it. Now, I don't think that's the case here. I suspect that the fact that I brought up this is really close to contact is probably relevant. Mm-hmm. But the rest of it's not there. Right. I would not want to publish that.
We have very, very, very cool and informative models of what it looks like when a group of colonial people enter into an area. My archaeology, my field work is here in New England, and when you dig here, you find a very clear point in stratigraphy where a completely new culture arrives with glazed ceramics, with glass, with iron, and it's if you had no if you just kind of if history stopped here in the middle and late 17th century, any archaeologist digging here would recognize immediately that there is substantial and convincing evidence that another group entered into this area with different garbage, with different stuff, with different technologies, and that's what we expect.
Yeah. Well, again,
we look.
I've mentioned this before. My dissertation is literally on, I would again be considered an expert on this. My dissertation is on a first contact or damn near first contact site. Cortez lands in 1519. My site was set up maybe in 1525, probably in 1528. Right. That's 9 years later. Okay. That's, and Europeans entered the area of what's known as El Salvador 5 years at most before the site I'm talking about. So it's basically a first contact site. Now, my site is really obvious. There are buildings, there are streetways, there are metallurgy, there's new technologies, there's things that are clearly imported. But here's the thing. We can also identify indigenous villages from the 16th century that are post-contact. Are most of the materials indigenous? Yes, they are. But there's a persistent residue that is not, and other things change. You start to no longer have indigenous religious symbols on pottery because it would have been considered, we know from the historical record, idolatry by the new Christian overlords. So you can tell. Now, could you tell me a 1530 versus a 1500 site? I don't know if you could do that unless there were a bunch of Spaniards there. But can you tell me a 1500 versus 1600 site? Yeah, you can. Even in a rural indigenous village, yes, you can.
Well, that's the cool thing, too, is in the American Southeast, De Soto's expedition through the Southeast, the Entrada into Florida, spent years, his group spent years in the Southeast. You can find at native sites, you can actually find brass bells, and you can find pieces of iron sword, and you can find Venetian beads in native context, but clearly they are trading with, they are obtaining these materials from an alien group with different technologies that are moving through the area. And again, I don't know South American archaeology well enough. A handful of chicken bones is really interesting, but it's not enough especially when, as Jeff says, the radiocarbon data is kind of late, and the genetic data don't support the notion that these things came from Polynesia. But are we doubting Thomas? You're damn right, but that's the way we approach everything.
No. And here's the thing. I think we're actually being a little harsher almost, because this could actually be this is not bullshit. I think that's right. We've now hit our drinking game when we're going to say it, or how long. But it should be kind of like anyway. The secret word was said, but or the lack of secret word. But this is not bullshit. This is actually a plausible concept, and when it becomes plausible, it's actually harder to laugh off. So we have to be damn serious about it.
Well, and Ken made a good segue for us, because one of the other objects that is brought up is a foreign object, is the sweet potato. And there is the argument made that there's two arguments that I hear about the sweet potato. And one is that it just floated across the ocean to other land and just took root and started growing. The argument that a lot of people who are pro-contact use is that it was actually a trade commodity. And this comes back to the linguistics things, apparently. And again, I am not a linguistic either. Whatever.
Well, let's get our biases out of the way. Let's have a show of hands. Who prefers sweet potato versus like normal potato for the food?
No, never. When they offer me sweet potato fries, I gag. I want French fries.
No,
real
sweet potatoes are
American French
delicious.
fries.
I'm kind of with Ken on this one. You like them?
Yeah.
I love sweet potato fries, especially with some mayonnaise or some dill sauce. Yeah, they're good.
What kind of sauce?
I like mine with dill sauce or like the flavored mayonnaises, aioli. I like that.
You know what? That might be okay.
It's good.
Yeah, I'm closer to Ken on this one.
But I like a savory sweet potato. I don't like a sweet potato.
Fresh French fries with ketchup.
Yeah, I am boring that way, but I'm with you.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to the actual science of sweet potatoes. I just thought that would be something, so we all know our biases.
I like sweet potatoes.
There you go. So you believe in Polynesians. bringing them because you like them. That's where we're going with, right?
I guess.
I believe in Polynesians because there's evidence they exist. As far as now, the sweet potato went from South America to Polynesia, right? To the Pacific Islands.
Yes, from South America
Yeah.
to Polynesia.
This one is the reverse of the chicken, and that's
Right,
that's where it comes in because they're like, this is
Well,
obviously
you're saying
a trade.
you're saying
thing.
that's the argument. You're saying that's the argument.
Yeah. The argument
Yes.
is that Polynesians landed. They made it to South America.
Right.
Saw sweet potatoes, said that hey, we could really do well with those.
Rather than
canoes.
having had them themselves all the time.
Right. Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, that they got them from the Americas, took them back home with them, and I guess in the process dropped off chickens. So that was the ongoing argument.
That's
It's
the
like-
trade.
It's like
That's the
settlers
quid
at
pro quo.
Catan. It's like I'll give
Yes.
you X number of chickens for sweet potatoes.
If you have sheep,
Yeah.
I have wood. Yes.
Now, the article that we'll include a link to the article is by Carolyn Roulier in 2013. Again, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and she looked at a whole ton of sweet potato. Now, one of the problems with sweet potatoes from an archaeological perspective is, these things do not preserve.
Yeah,
It's
no,
not
it's really
like
hard.
seeds or nut fragments. So the research that she did all involved both modern specimens, but also herbarium specimens. So these are things that dated back to even the late 17th century. And she had a bunch of stuff that, Captain Cook brought back. So we're looking at, in theory, these are sweet potatoes collected in Polynesia at very earliest contact. So there's been no contamination with, new batches of sweet potatoes brought in.
So again, that gets messy, but we'll
Right.
continue.
Yeah.
It's not
And
perfect.
in any event, her model is that sweet potatoes came into Polynesia in 3 waves. It's called
Okay.
the tripartite model.
All right.
The first is the sweet potato that in South America is called kumara, and it's got almost the identical name, getting into this linguistic argument,
Mhm.
throughout Polynesia. This is the stuff that's the most controversial, because this is dated in to between 1,000 and 1,100 AD. Now again, we don't have sweet potato dated to that period. We have an agricultural complex with the same tools that are found later on historically when they're growing sweet potatoes. So there is that logical jump where we're saying, well, we don't have sweet potatoes because they don't preserve, but we do have what appears to be the physical manifestations of the same complex that we find historically, and it goes back to as much as 1,000 AD.
Which is it is a logical jump, but it is a logical jump.
Yeah, exactly so. And that's the one that would have had to have made it from South America to Polynesia, obviously before Columbus, before Europeans entered South America. However, the next 2 steps, one is called the Camote lineage. That's from Mesoamerica. And then there's the Batata lineage of sweet potatoes, and that's from the Caribbean. And the historical evidence seems to indicate that second lineage, Camote, actually comes from Mesoamerica and was brought to Polynesia after AD 1500 by Spanish galleons. They loaded up with sweet potatoes. They're sailing west across the Pacific, and they're sharing sweet potatoes with Polynesians, for the most part, towards the western part of Polynesia.
And that would have to be after 1570. We can actually detect when they start the galleons start getting over after Manila is founded by the Spaniards, and we can literally detect when that happens because we start to find Ming porcelains. Like, this is archaeologically detectable. Yeah.
So that's cool. And then the third, this Batata, is also in the 1500s. That shows up in Western Polynesia, and that form, that genetically, is most closely related to Caribbean sweet potatoes. And the idea there is that actually got to Western Polynesia by Portuguese traders, but through Europe. So they're bringing it back to Europe, and eventually it goes the other direction.
Wow. So like around India and whatnot.
Yeah.
It's a well-traveled potato.
So now what they're suggesting is that there actually were 3 separate domestication events in the New World, at least 3, for the sweet potato, one in South America, one in Mexico, and one in the Caribbean, and that these are genetically different, and that in different ways they make it to Polynesia for what we're talking about here, the most important is this Kumara. That article has an amazing map showing the directions in which it's hypothesized these went. And you look at this Kumara in South America, again, getting back to the linguistics, it's Kumara or Kumar or Kumal. And in the Marquesas, the sweet potato there is called Kuma. In Easter Island, it's Kumara. In New Zealand, it's Kumara. That name shows up.
That starts to look pretty convincing.
Yeah. And then this camote, the last one from this is from Mexico, from Mesoamerica. If you look in the Philippines, if you look in China, in Japan, it's called camote, sometimes spelled with a C, sometimes with a K. And the same thing in in Micronesia, it's called batata, which is exactly the name given it by in the Caribbean, but that one's coming in from the other direction.
And so when we talk about Spaniards in the Philippines and other places, remember, it wasn't just Spaniards. There were Tlaxcalans, like basically people that were culturally kind of like the Aztecs. They were big enemies of the Aztecs and Tenochtitlan, who became what were called conquistadores mexicanos, basically Mexican or indigenous conquerors in Florida, in South America, and in the Philippines. I mean, they became part of the global Spanish Empire, and they were great settlers. In fact, the best settlers of northern Mexico, to the point where it annoyed the hell out of Spanish settlers because they did better, were indigenous, but not from the region. So they were colonists, but not from Europe.
But not
so
European.
We don't talk about that in our history books much, but a lot of the people, this is again, my site had a lot of these people, a lot of these colonists were not Europeans. There were Europeans or Africans, and there were a lot of indigenous Americans that then were colonists elsewhere and brought all sorts of stuff with them. So keep that in mind.
Including indigenous foods.
Languages, foods, the whole thing, yeah.
So far we've eliminated the chicken, and now I think we've effectively eliminated the sweet potato. So let's go to break real quick, and when we come back, we will talk about the last big piece of evidence, which are these sewn plank boats.
I'm Jessica Uquinto, and I'm the host of the Heritage Voices podcast. Heritage Voices focuses on how CRM and heritage professionals, public employees, tribes, and descendant communities can best work together to protect their heritage through tribal consultation, collaborative ethnography, and indigenous archaeology. Now back to the show.
Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One with pico and creamy chipotle ranch, and the other with bacon and avocado ranch. Chicken expert since 1990. Taco expert since now. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
Chicken tacos should only be trusted to chicken professionals.
That's where we come in. Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One comes with pico de gallo and creamy chipotle ranch. And the other comes with bacon, lettuce, tomato, and avocado ranch. Chicken expert since 1990. Chicken taco expert since now. Order yours today in the Zax Rewards app. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
And we are back, and I have misspoke. We did not eliminate the sweet potato because, Ken, as you pointed out,
yeah, the deal here is, at least in two of the incidences of movement of the
two out of three,
it's definitely post-contact. It's the Spanish and the Portuguese are pulling this stuff around, and as Jeb pointed out, there may be indigenous Mesoamericans who are in the Philippines who are bringing their indigenous foodstuffs with them. It's this third case, this Kumara, in which we don't have sweet potatoes that are fossilized. We're not recovering those archaeologically in Polynesia, but the agricultural complex that's seen by Spanish travelers, by English travelers, by colonists in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries for sure, it looks like that's been there for a long time. It's the same complex. So maybe, in fact, as much as 1,000 years ago, using the same tools, the same agricultural techniques, they are planting sweet potatoes. If that is the case, and we're not saying we're not saying it's certain. What we're saying is we cannot reject out of hand the possibility that, in fact, sweet potatoes made it into Polynesia, especially Eastern Polynesia, 500 years before the arrival of the Spanish, which would make it pre-contact.
This brings up an issue that we've talked about before. That might possibly be. Most of the people that talk about this are not interested in the friggin' sweet potato, no matter how much they like them with aioli. The reason they are interested, like people they want to argue are not saying that. They are instead arguing for oh, well, hang on. That means we can say everything is different. We can say everything is coming from one place to the other.
Right.
So it's one thing if it's like, oh, these people are this. But then you'll be like, what about color symbolism in Mesoamerica and in Asia? What about this? It's the old hyperdiffusionism. And this gets to the notion of I've banged on before about how a lot of people try to just treat antiquity. Like there's sort of historical time, and then once you get past that, it's all very flat, kind of proto-historic flatness. And they would want to argue, okay, well, you've got sweet potatoes 1,000 years ago, therefore it's before like European history, therefore everything can be back and forth now. It's like, that's not true at all.
Right.
So I don't know, that just bothers me a little.
No.
Well, it's
that's
all about, I mean, one of the important things to get out of this conversation is that we are not here saying under no circumstances is it possible for there to have been trans-Pacific contact before Europeans got there, and under no circumstances we're not saying, and we will never believe that happened. What we're saying is this has to be evidence-based. And in the case of the sweet potato, it's not a dead certainty that this happened 1000 AD. But what we're saying here is that we cannot reject that possibility out of hand. But as Jeb has just indicated, that doesn't mean there needs to be evidence to show that anything else accompanied the sweet potato.
And things may have, but it's not the things that people care about because they want to have hyperdiffusion to spread stuff around and basically to argue for single causes and arguably to reject all kinds of other things.
Right.
And on this topic, and people like Alice Kehoe and others would argue that there's a difference between what they're arguing for limited ties, relatively late on specific things versus big, broad, everything came from Asia because it really came from the old world. And on the one hand, that's true. On the other hand, I'm not an expert in that literature, but I've read some of that literature of people that are arguing for the limited. But then not always, but you do sometimes see it kind of start to slide in that direction. Like it does feel a little finding the hyperdiffusion in the gaps, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. It really can just be, I am very interested in these specific things, but sometimes it's not.
Well,
sometimes it's just a sweet potato.
Yeah, sometimes a potato is just a potato.
Which not good French fries, so I mean, who cares?
Sweet potatoes are delicious, and they are nutritious and good for the environment. But anyway.
Those last two definitely are true, but I'm also selfish, so.
It's all right. But so the last piece of evidence that usually gets brought up, and this is another one of those interesting, but I don't know how far it gets you details, is these sewn plank boats that were the main mode of transportation for the Polynesians, but are only seen in a couple places along the west coast there?
Mostly California.
Yeah, mostly California, and there's one place in Chile.
And are sewn plank boats the main? I mean, are dugout canoes and outrigger canoes?
They are not. I don't know if they're the main. They're one of them.
All right, they're one of several. Polynesians had their own. We talk about the age of exploration, and we always think of the Columbus and those guys, Magellan. The Polynesians had their own age of exploration before the Europeans ever got in boats and sailed across an ocean. And they were fully capable mariners. Absolutely.
Well, and I'm very sure that there were different kinds of boats. It wasn't just like, here's a boat and all boats are this boat. I'm pretty sure that they had like their short distance boats, their long distance boats, their heavy duty boats, their light boats. I mean, boats are like cars. You don't have one car. You have a variety of different types and styles and durabilities.
They have their sports utility boats.
Exactly.
SUVs.
The particular boat that we're talking about, an SUV boat.
What?
Stop! I'm trying to make a point.
That was amazing.
Thank you, Jeb.
So this sewn plank boat, and I'm going to say it wrong, so Jeb, you can probably correct me. It's called a dalca, D-A-L-C-A.
I have no idea.
So we're calling it a dalca boat. And it is claimed that the Chile people copied this style of sewing the planks together from the Polynesians. And if you've never seen a sewn plank boat, actually they've got a couple in the Smithsonian Natural History Museum. They're really neat looking, and they're really tightly laced together, and
yes,
they treat them. It's not like there's just like holes bored into wood and then really sloppy laced together. They're watertight, and they work with the swelling of the wood, and I think there's some kind of rosin they put on it to fill in the the leaky bits. They're very ingenious, and it's really clever, and I'm like, why would you have ever thought to sew two things together when, I don't know, it would seem simpler to just dig out a tree trunk, but apparently they did. And
well,
that's
it's like nails. I mean, you take planks and then you like stick them together with little tacks, which is what you're doing with the European stuff. So, it's a similar kind of sort of solution. Yeah.
And I guess it allows you to use less wood to make a larger object, because you can just, like with sewing, you can just stitch multiple pieces of fabric together to get one big piece. So you can do the same thing with the wood. And so this is one of the arguments is that this was brought over to the Americas along with other things that we have thusly debunked. But a lot of the technique is similar but not exact. The styles are similar but not exact, and it's another one of those weird linguistic black holes where it's like the words are kind of the same but not quite. So, this is another one of those, is this really possible evidence, or is this another one of those independent invention things that we've talked about in the show before, where you've got multiple cultures coming up with the same idea because it's a logical step in the evolution of a tech. I don't have a lot of wood, but I do have this twine, and if I put this tree resin on it, or pitch, or whatever I'm making, I mean, they were actually pretty inventive when it came to like the concoctions they could bring together back in the day. I mean, is it just a natural step to go from a dugout canoe to a sewn plank canoe to whatever the next step would have been? Or does it have to have been handed down from another culture?
And the answer is, I think, all the above. Yeah, I mean, I think that's why this is a compelling, and in many ways why we are being a lot more specific, I think, than we sometimes are, because this is, again, more plausible, and it kind of falls, I think, for a lot of archaeologists, sort of like one of these, this has not been proven, but I'll consider this.
Well, we're being more specific not only because this is more plausible, but because, as I said at the beginning, this is an actual, I mean, it's not like a burn the bridges down controversy, but it is a controversy within the field of archaeology. And as such, this is how we treat it. We have to have evidence, and it has to be as airtight as it can be before the greater community is going to accept it. So we can't have something lazily thrown out there and expected to be picked up as evidence. We have to chew this over completely and find all of the angles before we can say, yes, we will accept that as evidence.
Well, let's look at the flip side of this, though. We are routinely accused by people that want to have giants and aliens and white people, Vikings, and blah, 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 of not wanting to listen to anything that challenges what we say. It's like, what have we been doing for the last hour? Is we've been going, I don't think this has probably been proven, but I'll listen to this. If you get me more evidence, I'll believe it. Of course, these things are amenable to the Illuminati satanic conspiracy that pays all of us.
Right.
So we can be charitable in this case, unlike the giants that whenever we get the bones, we smash them up, like the good little satanic Illuminati conspiracy agents working for the CIA that we are.
Somebody's going to cut that clip out of this podcast now, Jeb. I hope you're happy with yourself.
I don't care anymore. I don't fucking care anymore. They can cut that clip too.
The thing here is, we've actually talked about this before. When this stuff hits popular media, it's all earth-shaking. The archaeologists are going to have to go back and rewrite the textbooks. And in all honesty, if chickens were really brought to South America and a handful of people are eating chickens,
I got to rewrite the textbooks.
You got to rewrite like a footnote in one of the textbooks.
Exactly.
And Ken, as the author of one of those textbooks, you would know.
Absolutely. But the good news is then what I have to do is tell students, that copy of the edition of the book you have, throw those away. You have to buy a brand new one. It's going to cost you more because we had to throw away the textbooks.
Yeah, no, you are actually incentivized financially to want to change the textbooks because you get more money
on a yearly basis. Yeah.
Look, and the thing I'm about to say, you may think I'm sounding funny, but I'm actually being serious. The only way this makes sense is literally if there is a global conspiracy of that frankly has to be kind of supernatural. And honestly, as I tell my students, if I was part of that, the clothing I'm wearing while I'm teaching you would be better.
Right.
Exactly. Yes.
As I'm sitting here in stuff from Kohl's and Old Navy or Pennies, I'm clearly not part of the Illuminati conspiracy. Okay, kids?
Well, I've actually gotten emails from people. This is basically
no offense to any of those stores.
Right.
But I've gotten emails from folks who have seen me on some stupid cable show, who actually accuse me of being of knowing the truth, but being part of the we know you know more than you're saying, Fader. We just haven't figured out why. And so I guess I'm here to admit that me and Jeb and Sarah, we are part of that conspiracy.
The Kohl's conspiracy?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, if you get one of their credit cards, they always tell you always get a nice discount. So on that particular order.
Exactly.
But to be fair, their prices are reasonable. Not even endorsing Kohl's. Nothing against Kohl's, but we weren't able to endorse
this
them.
podcast is not sponsored by the Kohl's Corporation.
Now, if you want to sponsor us, Kohl's, I got a phone number you can call.
One of the things that we talk about a lot in archaeology when we are trying to let's bring this back around to where we started, to distinguish from stuff that has been independently invented and developed in situ, in place, as opposed to a technology or a practice that has moved in from the outside. And one of the things we look for archaeologically is the evolution. Most technologies evolve. I mean, look at the cell phone you had 10 years ago, and look at the cell phone you have now. It takes a while for technologies to improve, to perfect. We see that with Egyptian pyramids. Egyptians don't just start building damn pyramids. They're building mastabas, and the mastabas get stacked, and then they try at an angle that's not so good, and so there are these fits and starts, these trial and error process that denotes an in situ development. When we see something move in wholesale, complete, an entire complex of things shows up more or less instantaneously, we're a hell of a lot more liable to at least consider the possibility that it came in from the outside as opposed to, it developed internally.
And in fact, there's an entire literature on how things get either adopted wholesale or in parts and are incorporated into existing code. We're not going to get into that, but it's one of the things I actually deal with is this a thing that just because it fits nicely with the existing culture just kind of gets adopted and really transformed, or does it bring a whole kind of complex with it? And it depends on what it is and how it fits in. Archaeologists spend a lot of time actually thinking about the issues that hyperdiffusion, et cetera, would do. We actually do kind of sort of know what we're talking about.
Yes.
Well, and I mean, along that line though, something like a boat would make a significant difference in the everyday lives of the people adopting it. Same thing with the chicken, maybe the sweet potato, because it's a good starchy source. So the things that we are talking about are things that would have radically changed, could potentially have radically changed the life around of the culture.
If Polynesians showed up a place, I'm like, well, did their boats change? Because that would be my very first question. I mean, that would be one of the things you would expect.
And that's the thing that is the thing that I have not heard associated with any of these. I have not read about, and then we see X and we see a culture shift, or we see a subsistence shift, or any of these things. I have not seen anything that is supportive of that statement.
Right.
So
they seem to be one-offs. Just one thing shows up.
Well, but something as significant as a chicken, I mean, to go back to what Jeb had said, or I think Ken asked this, could the chicken have become a major part of the subsistence pattern in 30 years? I say hell yeah. I mean, look at it. It craps out eggs on a daily basis, and then when it stops crapping out eggs, you can eat it. I mean, yeah, that's going to become a major source of protein.
And there are examples. And on the one hand, there are things that don't work that way. On the other hand, pigs became part of the subsistence pattern very quickly in Meso and South America, very, very quickly. And while there were peccaries, that was not it. I mean, they just adopted pigs because they were really useful.
Yeah.
Boats. So, I mean, the plank boat thing, like, I don't know what to think about it, but it's certainly the sort of thing that I'm like, okay, these people show up in these boats. What's the thing you're going to copy from them? These boats. Like, that actually makes sense to me. Whereas usually when we're dealing with hyperdiffusion, it's like, oh, and then we copied like a deep mystical concept. Well, did you take their iron?
Why would
you? Did you take their pottery? No, but we took that. Well, that's what the person cares about.
And that's my point. Go ahead.
No, in this case, it seems, again, more plausible, though needs more evidence.
Right, and that's what I'm saying. Like, the boat, to me, what we've talked about today, and with the lack of commentary on giant shifts in social and economic patterns of these people at the times that this is supposedly happening, it seems to me that this is an outcropping of the indigenous culture that's already there. This is an independent invention. Somebody went, oh, look, I can sew planks together and I have a boat. Isn't that a lot easier than spending a week digging out this log so that we have...
And that's also plausible.
Also, they're probably lighter because you're not dealing with an entire solid one piece of wood. I mean, you can make them thinner, I would imagine. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to move to something like a sewn plank boat, and the technology to do so was available in all of these cultures that have sewn plank boats. So the fact that we don't see a giant shift like we do see with other technology, like Ken, you were talking about with your bowls, the soapstone bowls, they basically go completely, they stop manufacturing them altogether almost when they get pottery.
Ceramics. Right.
Exactly. So it's like, that's something that is noticeable. If they had never had a plank boat before, this plank boat comes over and people are like, oh, here's some chickens, we'll take your sweet potatoes, and by the way, let's teach you how to make this boat. I would think that we'd see a major substance shift because now we've got chickens and that are much easier to take care of and a much easier protein source to get hold of. And you think you would see a shift into these boats because they might be a little like technologically more advanced, but they're still a better design, I would think, overall, or at least just different. But we don't see that.
Well, and so the chickens thing doesn't work for genetics.
The chickens thing does not work because of genetics, no.
Yeah. The sweet potato, maybe.
Maybe.
The boats, maybe. But they also could be independent invention. And the sweet potato, I mean, there really are mechanisms for discussing other kinds of these things moving around. But if there's a large agricultural complex, it's not impossible. This is where there are multiple plausible hypotheses, and it starts to come down to evidence. And I think that's, again, why we're getting more into specifics here than we often do.
Right. And, I mean, I'm going to go out there and say I don't think there was contact, which I think opens up a much more interesting question of, we know that there could have been contact. So why wasn't there? What was preventing them?
Aliens.
Yeah, right. So, and I think that's an interesting angle to look at as well. As close as they were and as skilled as they were, why were these cultures not interacting with each other? You know?
For me, it's one of these things that I'm like, right now, the evidence for it is really sketchy. But if somebody showed me evidence tomorrow, if somebody like showed up with a site of like ancient Romans in Minnesota,
right,
I'd be very friggin' skeptical. But I mean, maybe if it's really plausible,
I totally.
Whereas if I'd be interested, but I'd be real damn skeptical because it just doesn't make sense for any number of reasons. This one is like, if somebody showed up with a site where like, oh, look, we've got Polynesian pottery, I'd be like, okay, this is kind of culminated.
Right.
Like I could see it, but right now it's not there.
Right. And that's the thing. Like, we sent them back with potatoes, but we didn't send them back with anything to carry the potatoes in.
Yeah, no. I mean, there's problems. There's real problems. This is a lot closer than some of the things we talk about.
Right.
So wait a minute. So the Polynesians land on the coast of South America, then go back to Fiji, and all they have are T-shirts that say, I went to South America and all I got was this lousy T-shirt.
Basically,
it's tourism.
yeah.
It's just
and maybe it was.
Tourism.
Maybe it was.
This is kind of a related issue. When I was an undergraduate, Jeb, you'll probably recognize this guy's name, Pedro Armias.
No.
Was a Mesoamericanist years ago.
I don't actually.
All right. Really sweet guy. And he was talking about independent invention versus diffusion. And he said that generally speaking, when a culture, the recipient of diffused ideas, when they actually embrace a new idea, a new technology, they only are able to do so when they could have invented it on their own anyway, and they were at a point where they would have.
Exactly.
So, so it's like if you drop a bunch of iPhones in a traditional village in South America, they're not going to be pumping out iPhones next week.
Right.
Yeah, that gets back to it gets back to that literature of once it gets adopted and how it gets adopted. Yeah.
Right. Which again is something we really do. This isn't something we're hiding. It's not something that we are trying to conspiratorially keep under the cover. We do think about this, and we know what evidence should be there if this happened. In the case of especially in the case of the sweet potatoes and the plank boats, we're not there yet, but we're not throwing it out.
Right.
That's really interesting. We would like more evidence.
As skeptical as I've stated that I am about it, it's possible, and it's there. And like Ken said, if you can give me, I'm not against the idea, and if there was more to it, I would totally be like, yep, they brought plank boats and took potatoes.
But it could also just be independent invention. Like it also just could be wrong. Like we are in a place where it's hard to say.
Exactly. Right. And I think
we
that's
have to
the point.
And as in science, you know what? We have to be comfortable very often saying, we don't know.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. My final thought on this is, and I can't remember if I've told this story, but if I have, it's still a good story. When I was in graduate school, we had to take oral examinations where you were basically quizzed on, in our case, anything in our field, anything for me in Mesoamerica or anything in archaeology. So it was broad, and it was quizzed by 3 professors. So it was basically a panel of experts asking you, basically figuring out if you know what you're talking about. And one of mine, Dan Heelan, who's now retired from Tulane, he would not behind every question, but behind a lot of the questions go, are you sure about that? Now, we colloquially in English use that as basically a polite way of saying, I think you're wrong.
Right.
But he was doing that to me because he knew that my intention was, and I already was doing it to some degree, was to stand in front of people and talk with some element of authority about what I thought I knew. And I better be damn comfortable when I don't know what I'm talking about to admit it. And if you're not ready to do it. I mean, it's not quite like a Yoda on Dagobah sort of thing, but there's an element of you need to get in a mental space where you are humble enough to be able to actually say, I don't know.
Right.
My favorite one is, I'll look that up and get back to you.
Right.
That's
as
a
long
good
as
answer
you're
to
not
that one.
looking it up on Wikipedia, we're fine.
What, is there something wrong with Wikipedia? Damn it, my paper's all wrong.
Oh my God.
All right, guys, thank you very much. It's been a good episode.
Awesome.
And I will talk to you all later.
Great fun.
All right, thank you.
No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeosuit Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archifantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archifantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at Archifantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. Thanks again for listening.
No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. We don't do dinosaurs.
This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle and edited by Chris Sims.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One with pico and creamy chipotle ranch, and the other with bacon and avocado ranch. Chicken expert since 1990. Taco expert since now. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
Is your vehicle stopping like it should? Does it squeal or grind when you brake? Don't miss out on summer brake deals at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.